Commander Li Jun wiped his sweaty palms on his dress uniform for the fifth time. The massive crystalline hall of the Kyoran royal palace made him feel small. Light bounced off the gem-like walls, creating dancing patterns across the polished floor. His reflection stared back at him from 1,000 angles. Breathe, he reminded himself. Just breathe. As Earth's first ambassador to the Kyoran people, Li carried the weight of humanity on his shoulders. The Kyorans had technology centuries beyond Earth's, faster than light travel, gravity manipulation, and energy sources humans had only dreamed about. Making a good impression wasn't just important, it was essential. The assembled Kyoran officials stood in perfect rows, their iridescent skin shimmering like oil on water. Their elongated bodies towered over Li, and the head tendrils that served as both sensory organs and emotional displays remained perfectly still, a sign of formal attention. A musical tone sounded, and the Kyorans bowed as one. Li hastily followed suit, hoping he'd gotten the angle correct. The diplomatic briefings had been clear. Too shallow showed disrespect. Too deep indicated submission. Her Royal Highness, Princess Hana of the High Council of Kyora, first daughter of the Stellar Dynasty, announced a Kyoran with gold-tinted skin. Li looked up and almost gasped. Princess Hana glided into the room, her movements so fluid she seemed to float. Her skin shifted between deep blues and purples, with specks of light that reminded Li of stars. Unlike the other Kyorans, whose head tendrils were bound in formal restraints, hers flowed freely around her face, marking her royal status. The small translator device at her throat hummed to life as she approached Li. "We welcome Earth's emissary to Kyora," she said, her actual speech a series of musical tones the translator converted to English. "May this meeting mark the beginning of understanding between our worlds." Li bowed again and recited his practiced greeting. "The people of Earth extend friendship and gratitude for your welcome, Your Highness." Princess Hana's head tendrils rippled slightly. Li had been told this indicated pleasure or approval. His tense shoulders relaxed a fraction. The formal reception moved to an enormous dining hall where foods from both worlds were displayed. Li had been extensively briefed on Kyoran cuisine and carefully avoided dishes marked with subtle warnings. Some Kyoran delicacies contained compounds that would send a human into anaphylactic shock. As the meal progressed, Princess Hana engaged Li in conversation about Earth culture, asking insightful questions about music, art, and human family structures. Her interest seemed genuine, and Li found himself relaxing into the discussion. When the final course was served, the time came for Li to formally propose the trade agreement, the real purpose of his mission. He'd memorized the phrases carefully, practicing them for weeks with linguistic experts. He stood, raising the ceremonial cup of Kyoran nectar as instructed. "Princess Hana, honored representatives of Kyora, I come bearing an offer of mutual benefit and lasting connection between our worlds." Li continued with the formal phrases, noting how the Kyoran officials leaned forward with interest. But halfway through his speech, he noticed something strange. The translator at his throat grew unusually warm. Princess Hana's head tendrils suddenly stood straight up, a reaction not covered in his briefing materials. As he finished the proposal with the ritual words, "May our people's paths join in prosperity," the entire hall went silent. The Kyoran officials' skin tones shifted rapidly between colors. Princess Hana stood slowly, her eyes, multifaceted like a dragonfly's, fixed on Li. Her head tendrils were now fully extended, quivering slightly. "Earth Ambassador," she said, her translator producing perfectly clear English despite the obvious shock in her posture. "Am I understanding correctly?" Li nodded, suddenly uncertain. "The trade agreement, yes." Princess Hana's skin flushed a bright pink. Embarrassment, Li recalled from his briefings. "Wait, you want me to be your wife? Seriously?" she asked, her voice filled with shock. Li's blood ran cold as the translator finally displayed the error on his handheld device. The ceremonial phrase he'd recited wasn't a trade proposal at all. It was a royal marriage request. Li sat in the small meeting room adjacent to the grand hall, his face buried in his hands. Around him, a hastily assembled team of human diplomats whispered urgently. The walls seemed to close in on him as the full weight of his mistake settled on his shoulders. Across the polished stone table, Advisor Sung, the chief diplomat of the Kyoran people, sat with perfect posture. His skin had shifted to a formal shade of deep blue, and his head tendrils were pulled back tightly in what Li now recognized as the Kyoran equivalent of a severe expression. Ambassador Li, Sung said, his translator producing crisp, formal English, "I understand this was not your intention. However, this cannot be undone without grave insult." Li looked up, desperation clear in his eyes. There must be some way to explain. It was a translation error. Surely your people can understand that. Sung's skin rippled slightly, a sign of discomfort. You must understand our customs. A rejected marriage proposal between leaders indicates fundamental incompatibility between peoples. It would signal to all Kyoran citizens that humans consider us unworthy. But I never intended. Li pressed his hands against his temples, trying to will away the growing headache. Princess Hannah entered the room, and everyone rose immediately. Her skin had shifted to a controlled shade of pale blue, formal and distant. The warmth Li had glimpsed during their dinner conversation was gone. Ambassador Li, she addressed him directly. Intent matters little in diplomacy. What matters is perception and tradition. Her translator hummed softly as she continued. We must maintain the engagement until we find a solution that preserves relations between our worlds. Li stared at her, disbelief evident on his face. You want us to pretend to be engaged. It is the only way. Sung interjected. Humans have much to gain from relations with Kyora. Your world needs our technology. And we have interests in Earth as well. Li's communications officer suddenly cleared her throat. Sir, we have an urgent transmission from Earth Command. Admiral Park is requesting to speak with you immediately. 5 minutes later, Li stood before a holographic projection of Admiral Park, Earth's chief of interstellar relations. Li had finished explaining the situation, expecting outrage or at least concern. Instead, Admiral Park laughed until tears streamed down his face. When he finally composed himself, he wiped his eyes. Only you could accidentally propose to an alien princess, Li. This is going in the history books for sure. Sir, this is serious, Li protested. They expect me to go through with an engagement ceremony. Admiral Park's expression sobered slightly, though his eyes still twinkled with amusement. Li, listen carefully. Earth needs this alliance. The cure and clean energy technology alone could solve our climate crisis, not to mention their medical advances. So I just pretend to be engaged to Princess Hannah. For now, yes. Our analysts will work with you to find a diplomatic solution that allows both sides to save face. But until then, congratulations on your engagement, Ambassador. The hologram flickered off before Li could protest further. When he returned to the diplomatic chamber, Princess Hannah was waiting alone. For a brief moment, Li thought he saw a flicker of empathy in the way her head tendrils moved. I understand this is difficult for you, she said quietly. It is unexpected for me as well. Li sighed. My superiors want me to proceed with the engagement while we look for a solution. Hannah nodded. As I expected, humans need our technology, just as we need certain resources from Earth. She rose gracefully, towering over Li by nearly a foot. The High Council has scheduled the engagement ceremony in 27 Earth days. She informed him, her voice professional again. We should begin preparations. 27 days. Li echoed weakly. Yes, you will need to learn our customs, ceremonial language, the proper attire. She paused, studying his expression. For a moment, her skin shifted to a softer shade of blue. Do not worry, Ambassador Li. I will guide you through this process. As she moved toward the door, Li could have sworn he saw a small ripple of amusement pass through her head tendrils. Princess, he called after her, Do your people have a concept of humor? Hannah turned, and for the first time since the disastrous dinner, the lights beneath her skin brightened slightly. We do, Ambassador Lee, and I believe we are both going to need it. The morning light filtered through the translucent dome of the royal training chamber. Lee stood at the edge of the padded circle, watching Princess Hannah with undisguised fascination. For the past week, they had spent 3 hours each day together, learning about each other's cultures as part of their engagement preparations. Today was Lee's first glimpse of Kyoran combat training. Princess Hannah moved like water through the air. Her tall, slender body twisted and turned in ways that seemed impossible. Her head tendrils flowed around her face, occasionally extending outward in quick, precise movements that Lee now understood were offensive strikes. In Kyoran combat, those sensitive tendrils could deliver a paralyzing nerve pulse. This is the 6th form, she explained between movements. It dates back 12,000 Earth years. Lee tried not to show his shock. Human civilization had barely existed that long. Hannah paused, studying Lee with her multifaceted eyes. Your species seems physically fragile, yet you've survived asteroid impacts, plagues, and climate disasters, she observed. Our scientists find this remarkable. Humans are stubborn, Lee replied with a small smile. He stepped onto the training mat and demonstrated a basic defensive stance from his military training. We don't give up easily. Hannah's skin shifted to a curious yellow-green. Show me more. For the next hour, they exchanged basic combat forms. Lee demonstrated human martial arts, while Hannah showed him modified Kyoran movements that humans could physically perform. By the end, they were both breathing heavily, and Lee noticed that Hannah's formal reserve had melted slightly. You learn quickly, she said, offering him a cloth to wipe his sweat. Most Kyorans believe humans lack adaptability. And what do you believe, Princess? Lee asked. Her head tendrils rippled in what Lee had come to recognize as thoughtfulness. I am revising my assessment daily. After cleaning up, they continued their cultural exchange with a tour of the Royal Botanical Gardens. The massive biodome contained carefully maintained ecosystems from dozens of worlds. To Lee's surprise, one section was dedicated entirely to earth plants. This garden has existed for over 200 years, Hannah explained as they walked past familiar trees and flowers. She stopped beside a cluster of small blue flowers. These are native to your Mongolia region. We've studied Earth for generations. Lee stared at her in shock. 200 years. But we only developed radio communication less than 2 centuries ago. Hannah's skin darkened slightly. Embarrassment, Lee had learned. We have been observing Earth since your medieval period. Your planet is unusual in its biodiversity and cultural development. As Lee processed this revelation, something caught his eye. A shadow moving unnaturally among the exotic plants. His military training kicked in as he noticed a Kyoran with unfamiliar markings emerging from behind a large fern. The stranger's skin bore jagged patterns Lee hadn't seen before, and in his hand was something that looked unmistakably like a weapon. It was pointed directly at Princess Hannah. Lee reacted without thinking. He lunged forward, tackling the princess to the ground as a burst of energy sizzled through the air where she had been standing. They tumbled behind a thick trunk tree as another blast scorched the bark. Royal guards flooded the garden within seconds, surrounding the attacker. Lee remained protectively crouched over Hannah until the guards called the all clear. As they got to their feet, Lee noticed that Hannah's skin had turned a deep purple color he hadn't seen before. Her head tendrils were quivering slightly. Are you hurt? He asked urgently. No, she replied, her multifaceted eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. You risked your life to protect me. Lee shrugged. Instinct. I'm trained to respond to threats. As they were escorted back to the palace by a dozen guards, Hannah remained unusually quiet. Finally, as they reached the royal chambers, she turned to him. Perhaps humans aren't as primitive as I thought, she said, her skin slowly shifting to a warm golden hue that Lee had never seen her display before. "You are surprising, Ambassador Lee." For the first time since his diplomatic disaster began, Lee felt that perhaps their two species might understand each other after all. The Great Hall gleamed with crystal decorations for the engagement ceremony. After 3 weeks of intense preparation, Lee had memorized the ancient Kyoran vows and learned the proper ceremonial movements. His formal attire, a blend of human diplomatic uniform and Kyoran royal colors, felt stiff and heavy. Thousands of Kyorans filled the hall, their skin displaying formal patterns of blue and gold. The High Council members sat on elevated platforms, and delegates from Earth watched nervously from a special section. Lee spotted Admiral Park, who had arrived yesterday to witness this historic event. Princess Hannah entered to a musical fanfare. She looked regal in her ceremonial robes, her head tendrils adorned with tiny gemstones that caught the light. When their eyes met across the hall, Lee noticed something like resignation in her expression. The ceremony began with the High Elder reciting the ancient history of Kyora. Lee was supposed to approach the central platform when the Elder finished the traditional opening. But before the Elder could complete his speech, a thunderous explosion shook the entire chamber. Panels in the ceiling crashed down. Armed Kyorans with jagged militant markings poured in from multiple entrances. Their skin displayed aggressive red patterns that Lee had learned indicated the extremist pure Kyora movement. "Death to human influence," one shouted, his translator broadcasting the message clearly as he fired an energy weapon into the crowd. The engagement hall erupted in chaos. Guards moved to protect the High Council members while panicked guests scrambled for safety. Lee saw Admiral Park organizing Earth delegates into a defensive position. Lee's military training took over. He sprinted toward Princess Hannah, who stood frozen on her platform. An energy blast struck near her feet as Lee reached her, pulling her down behind a fallen decorative column. "Stay down," he ordered, peering around the edge to assess the situation. Royal guards were engaging the attackers, but they were outnumbered. Hannah's skin had paled to a ghostly white, her head tendrils pulled tight against her head in distress. "They should not have been able to enter the royal palace," she said, her voice shaking. "Why now?" Lee shouted over the commotion of battle. "What makes the alliance so threatening to them? This isn't just xenophobia, is it?" Hannah looked at him for a long moment, then her expression turned pained. "Our sun is dying, Lee," she finally admitted. "Within 50 Earth years, it will begin to collapse, making our world uninhabitable." Lee stared at her in shock as she continued. "Your scientists have developed theoretical techniques to reinvigorate stellar cores. We've observed your work on solar manipulation. The marriage was meant to cement an alliance that would save our world." Her head tendrils trembled. "The Pure Kyora movement believes we should solve our problems without outside help. They see accepting human assistance as weakness." The revelation hit Lee like a physical blow. "Why didn't you just ask us for help? Why the elaborate marriage scheme?" The High Council feared Earth would demand too high a price for such technology. They believed a royal bond would ensure your loyalty. Hannah's skin darkened with shame. "I did not agree with their methods, but I am bound to serve my people." A determined look crossed Lee's face. He grabbed a fallen guard's communication device. "Admiral Park," he called into it. "Status report." "We've secured the Earth delegation." Park's voice came back. "Kyoran security is gaining the upper hand. What do you need?" "Protection to reach the central platform. I have a speech to make." 20 minutes later, as security forces contained the last of the attackers, Lee stood at the central platform. The ceremony was in ruins, but most of the dignitaries remained, shaken but unharmed. The communications array was still functioning, broadcasting to the entire Kyoran population. "People of Kyora and Earth," Lee began, his voice steady. "Today we have seen the cost of misunderstanding and secrets between our peoples." He looked directly at the High Council. "I now understand the real purpose behind this alliance. Your world faces a grave threat, and you believed a royal marriage was necessary to secure Earth's help." Lee straightened to his full height. I speak now for humanity when I say, no marriage is needed between our peoples. We offer our help freely, as allies, not through ceremonial bonds. That is the true strength of humanity. We extend our hand to those in need, asking only friendship in return. The hall fell silent. The High Council members looked at each other in confusion. Lee turned to find Princess Hannah standing beside him. For the first time since he'd met her, her head tendrils relaxed completely, flowing freely around her face. "You continue to surprise me, human," she said, her skin glowing with a warm golden light that spread throughout the pattern on her face. She turned to address her people, standing shoulder to shoulder with Lee. "Today marks a new beginning between our worlds, one based on truth and mutual respect." The observatory deck offered a perfect view of the launch platform 5 miles below. Through the transparent floor, Lee could see thousands of Kurans and humans working together around the massive solar revitalization vessel. The ship glowed with blue energy as final preparations were made for launch. Lee adjusted the collar of his new uniform. No longer just an ambassador, he now served as Earth's first interstellar cooperation director. The past 6 months had been the busiest of his life, coordinating teams of scientists, engineers, and diplomats from both worlds. "Nervous?" Princess Hannah asked, joining him at the observation rail. Her skin displayed a calm pattern of blues and greens that Lee had come to recognize as her professional demeanor. "A little," Lee admitted. "This is the largest joint project in human history, if it works." "When it works," Hannah corrected him with a gentle ripple of her head tendrils. "Your scientists' theories combined with our quantum engineering will succeed." Lee nodded, appreciating her confidence. In the months since the failed engagement ceremony, they had developed a comfortable working relationship. Today, they would witness the launch of humanity's most ambitious project, a probe designed to reinvigorate the failing Kuran sun. "The Pure Cura movement has largely disbanded," Hannah said, watching workers move below. "Your people's generosity without demands proved their fears unfounded. Their leader made a public apology last week." "Turns out humans aren't the power-hungry conquerors they imagined," Lee said with a small smile. "And Kurans aren't the secretive manipulators some of your people feared," Hannah replied. Her translator had been upgraded to capture more nuance in her voice. Lee nodded toward a group of Kuran scientists working alongside humans. "Earth's scientists are already adapting your quantum technology," he responded. "We both gain from cooperation. Our climate restoration projects are decades ahead of schedule thanks to Kuran energy systems." A musical tone rang throughout the facility. Launch was imminent. Workers cleared the platform as the massive vessel's engines began to pulse with increasing intensity. The observatory filled with dignitaries from both worlds, including Admiral Park and the Kuran High Council. Directorly, Princess Hannah, Admiral Park greeted them. "History in the making today." The countdown began. Lee felt a light touch on his arm and looked down to see one of Hannah's head tendrils briefly making contact, a gesture of friendship that would have been unthinkably informal 6 months ago. The great engines ignited fully, bathing the launch area in brilliant light. The ground trembled as the stellar probe lifted slowly at first, then with increasing speed. Everyone watched in silence as the massive ship climbed toward the stars, carrying the hopes of the Kuran civilization with it. 3 years until it reaches our sun," Hannah said quietly, "and another year before we know if the revitalization works." "We'll face that challenge together," Lee replied. As the vessel disappeared into the upper atmosphere, applause broke out across the observatory. Humans and Kurans congratulated each other, no longer separated by suspicion or protocol. Later, when the formal celebrations had ended, Lee found himself alone with Hannah on a small balcony overlooking the Kuran capital city. The 3 moons cast a silver light over the crystalline towers. "Your translator still working?" Lee asked, noticing she hadn't spoken for some time. "Yes," she replied. "I was just thinking about how differently things might have gone if you hadn't accidentally proposed, if we had kept our son's condition secret." Sometimes accidents lead to better outcomes than careful plans, Lee said. You know, Hannah said with the slight head tilt that Lee had learned indicated Kieran humor. Being your wife might not have been entirely terrible. Lee laughed, surprised by her candor. That's quite a compliment coming from Kieran royalty. Perhaps the highest compliment I can give a human, she agreed, her skin glowing with warm golden tones that Lee now understood signified genuine happiness. Lee smiled. There's always the next diplomatic crisis. Indeed, though perhaps with fewer translation errors. As their laughter mingled in the night air, Lee realized something profound had happened. Beyond saving a star and forming an alliance, two very different species had found common ground in the vastness of space, not through formal treaties or arranged marriages, but through trust, honesty, and the simple joy of friendship. The future, like the stars above them, seemed bright with possibility.